Hi guys, welcome back or welcome to DreamWorks Switch to Life. And in today's video, we are reviewing DreamWorks' latest movie, Dogman, which I was actually very happy with. It was a lot better than I expected. I think a big reason for that is that unlike the Captain Underpants movie, where I grew up with the books, I really only read the first two books in the Dogman series, and because of that, wasn't really invested in the actual Dogman lore. And because of that, when I was watching the movie, I was very surprised at how mature this thing was. Not only was it super funny, which was simply amazing, I loved the humor for this movie, but it was also super emotional. I really enjoyed how it dives into some really grim topics like parental abandonment. Honestly, if you haven't seen this movie, go and watch it. Not only because it's actually really good, but also because if you're waiting for this to come to a streaming service, you might want to watch it in theaters anyway, because there's also a bad guy short film, Little Lies and Alibis, accompanying the movie. Which, I will admit, Little Lies and Alibis, not exactly the best short film. So, the short film starts with Mr. Wolf and the gang showing up to their parole meeting 10 minutes late. And the rest of the short explains why they're 10 minutes late. And in the process, we're just seeing a bunch of flashback sequences where the gang is getting pummeled, punished, and for no good reason, they end up breaking a few laws, trying to say, we want to go good and not break any more laws. Honestly, the best part of the short film, however, is the fact that when they showed up early for their meeting, they decided to go across the street to stop a bank robbery being robbed by a couple of guys who want to dress up as them and follow in their bad guy legacy. Unfortunately, that actually does make them 10 minutes late for their meeting, and in the process, they explain why they're late, only for it to be revealed that they're not even at their parole meeting, they're just at the post office, and they've been venting to a post office manager. So now they're 4 hours late for their parole meeting, and yeah, that's pretty much the short. Honestly, I kind of liked it. It was pretty funny with the slapstick, but unfortunately, just not necessary. I do not recommend going to the theaters just to watch the short film. However, if you want, you can watch the short film in theaters or buy Dogman on Blu-ray, DVD, and digital later, but it will not be coming to a streaming service. So go watch Dogman and support the film, but at the same time, make sure to enjoy Dogman because Dogman is actually really good. Let's talk about it. First off, the animation. This movie was made with a $40 million animation budget, and I'm just gonna say that that's actually pretty cheap for most animated movies. I know that DreamWorks usually tries to go for the $80-100 million range, so $40 million is actually really good. Keep that in mind because the animation for this movie is a little bit crude. And I think a big reason for that is it's done on purpose. It's supposed to look like it's super bad animation because this is supposed to be drawn by fourth graders. So if you don't know, Dogman is the very first comic book that was ever made by George Beard and Harold Hutchins, the main characters of the Captain Underpants franchise. We don't really know when they created this version of the Dogman comic, which I'm talking about the movie here, but we do know that Dogman is the very first superhero that they ever created together. So with that in mind, this movie is supposed to be a representation of that comic book. This is supposed to be a super bad animated movie made by kindergartners. That's why the animation looks so crude, and that's what makes it so good. Also, another reason the animation doesn't look that great is because DreamWorks didn't animate this movie themselves. Instead, they passed it off to a completely different animation studio, Jellyfish Pictures, which is also the studio that made Spirit Untamed, which, in my opinion, looks nowhere near as good as Dogman, but still. Though, honestly, I'm kind of exaggerating when I say the animation is bad because it's actually really good, especially considering the budget. Granted, I do have a couple complaints. For instance, the background isn't really that detailed. In fact, it's often super blurry, especially whenever the camera is moving around. However, the characters and their movements are super good. Or maybe I should say super good. Yeah, that's actually a Dogman trademark, but honestly, let's talk about that. There are a few instances in the writing where the characters are straight up missaying words, like serialously. And the big reason for that is even in the official books, they try to keep it in mind that this is made by fourth graders. There's going to be some misspelled words. The fact that they kept that in mind when they were making this movie is really cool. Speaking of, I absolutely loved the humor for this movie. The writing was super good. Though I do have to admit that, again, I haven't actually read all of the Dogman books. However, I have read some snippets here and there, and I just realized that there are a lot of scenes in the books that are in the movie word for word. I mean, obviously the movie didn't take the entire book series and just create it in one long movie. They just took a few scenes here and there and there and here, and then they shambled it all together into a cohesive story, which I really loved. Next, let's talk about the voice acting. Honestly, I really enjoyed the voice acting because a lot of the voice actors did a great job with their characters. I especially thought that Dogman's voice actor was really good. Honestly, the fact that Peter Hastings gave so much emotion to his character, even though all his character ever does is go, barf, barf, argh, yeah, all he ever does is make dog noises, but despite that, Peter Hastings portrayed so much emotion with his character. In fact, he also portrayed a different character, Officer Knight, who is the police officer who dies in order to create Dogman. We'll talk more about that later, but for now, the rest of the voice cast is, little bit weird. I actually enjoy the voice acting they did. They brought a lot of emotion to their characters, did such an amazing job. The problem is that you can definitely tell that they were A-list celebrities. Like Pete Davidson as Petey the Cat was a little bit weird, but honestly, after watching the movie, I realized he just fit the character. He's nothing like I imagined in the books, but still, he fits the character, which is really good. But yeah, honestly, with the exception of Little Petey's, who is played by an actual kid, the rest of the cast is mostly just A-list celebrities, but the fact is, they're bringing their A-game to this movie, which is really good. As for the music, well, the music is actually super forgettable, to be honest. I think it's good, it's tense when it needs to be, it's emotional when it needs to be, but the problem is that it's just there's nothing memorable about it. But honestly, it kind of makes sense. They weren't trying to showcase powerful music with this movie. Instead, they were trying to give us wacky sound designs, which was actually really good. A bunch of weird, kooky noises that carried the story instead of the music, which was a little bit weird, but honestly, it's the funny kind of weird. It just added to the humor of this movie. And finally, it's time to dive into the story, and I gotta say that I really enjoyed the story. It was pretty emotional, but there are a lot of glaring issues about it. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind when watching this movie, this is made by fourth graders, or at least it's trying to make it feel like it's made by fourth graders. Because of that, you really have to suspend your disbelief. However, that brings me to my first problem. George and Harold were not in the movie. I mean, obviously they make a cameo appearance as background characters, that much is fairly obvious. The problem is that the movie didn't start with an introduction of them introducing that this is one of their comic books, which I really would have appreciated. And if they couldn't do it at the start of the movie, they could have at least done it in an end credit scene. However, I did enjoy the fact that we did get George and Harold as a small cameo. They look completely different, but it still works because these George and Harolds are just self-inserts in their own comic book. They're not the actual George and Harold, just drawn like them. Another thing I felt was missing from the movie is, well, let's talk about it. The movie starts with Officer Knight and Greg the dog, two police officers, are trying to capture Petey the cat, the world's most evilest cat. The thing is, Petey is trying to lure them into a trap and he plans to kill both of them with a bomb. And unfortunately, the bomb goes off and it nearly kills both Officer Knight and Greg. Unfortunately, Officer Knight's head is dying and Greg's body is dying. And that's when the nurse and the doctor come up with an idea. What if they sew the dog's head onto the man's body? And thus, Dogman is born. And in the process, while Greg managed to live because his brain was still alive, Officer Knight ended up dying. So the fact is, they just zoomed right past Officer Knight's death. In fact, at the start of the film, they both say, "If I don't make it, take care of my loved ones for me." For Greg, it's about a tennis ball, but for Officer Knight, it's about his girlfriend. The three of them were kind of this perfect family, at least in Greg's eyes. And unfortunately, when Dogman returns to their old home, he realized that that girlfriend just moved on super fast with her new boyfriend. And what makes it even worse is that she straight up sold their house, so now Dogman has to go find a brand new house to live. But, because he's a dog, he doesn't have a lot of money. She didn't even stand around to say goodbye to Greg when he got out of the hospital, which is really sad. I have mixed feelings because I kind of figured they would move right past Officer Knight's death with no problems whatsoever, but I also was hoping they would bring it up later, like how Greg actually misses having his best friend and master, and he's trying to replace him with Chief, but Chief is not that best friend. Well, we never got a story like that, which is why it's so disappointing to me. But honestly, aside from those two glaring issues, this movie is really good. It's extremely funny and it tells one cohesive story after having a montage of Dogman catching Petey, Petey getting out of prison, 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 Dogman catching Petey, Petey getting out of prison. But after that montage, that's really where this movie shines. So anyway, Petey has once again managed to escape from prison, and the mayor has decided to pull Dogman off of the Petey case. The fact of the matter is that Dogman is the best at catching Petey the cat. The problem is that the cat jail just doesn't do a good job of keeping him in prison. So the mayor, being the jerk, corrupt politician that she is, decides to take the best cop off of the Petey case. So instead, Chief decides to give a new assignment to Dogman, which, there's a bit of backstory here that is not explained in the best way. So apparently, the Chief rushes through an introduction of Flippy the Fish. Flippy is the main villain of this movie. He is an evil fish who, before this movie even started, died. Yeah, there's a bit of an origin story there that is not explained in the best way, but if you really want that origin story, just read the second book in the Dogman series and you'll get the gist. But anyway, scientists want to study Petey's dead body to see if they can figure out how he unlocked his super intelligence. Meanwhile, Petey the cat, who for the past few months has been trying to find some way to destroy Dogman, hears a news report about Flippy and comes up with the plan to steal Flippy's dead body, at which point he will reprogram his evil to destroy all do-gooders, and then he will send the dead body into a living spray factory where hopefully the living spray will make Flippy come to life, at which point he will destroy Dogman. Meanwhile, he also has a henchman who I really loved because she has a real snarky attitude. Problem is that in the first 5 minutes of the movie, she actually quits working for Petey, but she still keeps coming back to say, "I'm still waiting for my paycheck," and she keeps complaining, but she also adds something to the story every time she shows up, something that motivates Petey to take the next step in his master plan. One instance is when she says, "The only person who can stand working for you is yourself," which gives Petey the idea to clone himself. So he orders a cloning machine online, and when it shows up, he pulls a whisker off his face and puts it in the cloning machine. And when he opens the door, it's a little kitten. Apparently, the cloning machine only makes babies. You have to wait 18 years for your clone to mature to adulthood. But anyway, this new clone, named Little Petey, is just so flipping cute. I love him. I would die for this little kitten. Anyway, he acts exactly like how a toddler would act. Always asking, why? Why? And he's also always seeking his papa's attention. And eventually he writes a comic book, which Petey just discards, at which point Petey tries to put his plan of sending Flippy down a chimney chute into the living spray factory to use. And unfortunately, he misses because little Petey was being annoying. And so Petey comes up with an idea to just send little Petey out for adoption in a free kitten box. And so little Petey realizes that his father has abandoned him and just decides to sleep in the middle of the road, where Dogman, in the nick of time, manages to rescue him from being run over by a truck, at which point Dogman takes him home. Speaking of, Dogman lives in a TARDIS. He straight up lives in a doghouse, and yet when you go inside, it's the size of a normal house.
Smaller on the outside.
Okay. That is a first.
Anyway, Dogman essentially becomes an adoptive father to little Petey and basically raises him for a few days. Meanwhile, Petey is a little upset because he found the comic book that was made by little Petey, and inside was an idea for a machine called ADHD. Petey begins to realize that this cat isn't just some annoying little kitten, he's really him, just younger. And then his henchman shows him a photo of Dogman and little Petey together. Little Petey is living with his arch enemy, Dogman. So he uses ADHD to rescue Petey from Dogman. And then he comes up with a new plan to use a squirrel bomb to destroy Dogman. And it turns out that little Petey is having a plan of his own. He has ADHD try to locate and find Petey's papa because he wants Petey to be happy like he is now that he has his own papa. It turns out that Petey doesn't want to see his dad because his dad abandoned him and his mom after robbing their whole house and then leaving them in the dirt. But despite that, little Petey still goes through with his plan, at which point ADHD returns with who I'm going to call Old Man Petey. And the thing is, Old Man Petey does absolutely nothing for the story. However, he does add a lot of emotional tension for the plot. An example is that little Petey is trying to convince Petey to get reacquainted with his dad. And that's when there's this really cute interaction of Petey saying, "I don't want to talk to him. He abandoned me. Don't you know how that feels?" "Yeah, I do. And I forgave you." That line just hits so hard, and honestly, it really made me want Old Man Petey and Petey to rekindle their relationship. Unfortunately, that never really happens because apparently Old Man Petey is just incapable of love. The fact that little Petey even told him that sometimes love isn't just a concept, it's something you can do for another person. By doing an act, you're showing that you love them. Unfortunately, Old Man Petey never does any act whatsoever out of love. In fact, we'll talk more about him later. Anyway, Dogman is missing little Petey and goes with Sarah Hadoff, a news reporter, as well as her dog Zuzu, which, by the way, I'm honestly surprised that this movie did absolutely nothing to hint at the love dynamic between Dogman and Zuzu. However, there is a love dynamic between the chief of police and Sarah Hadoff. In fact, both of them outright specify that they have crushes on each other, but it's just poorly written. I did not like that dynamic at all. They just say, "It's not because I have a crush on you or anything like that," even though it's very clear they do, and then they just fall in love. It's so weird. It was very poorly written. But anyway, back to the not poorly written part of the plot. While searching for little Petey, Dogman is attacked by Petey the cat, at which point he and Dogman get into a fight, and then eventually Dogman manages to arrest and capture Petey, at which point little Petey shows up, and then little Petey asks Dogman, "Why are you arresting my papa?" And so Dogman's entire conception of little Petey is shattered, but that's when Flippy attacks. Okay, let's rewind a bit. Remember when I said that Petey the cat was trying to capture an evil dead fish and then throw him into a living spray factory, hoping that he would come to life. Well, it turns out that while the initial throw did miss, the employees decided to play around with the dead body, and unfortunately, it ended up puncturing a living spray tank, and the living spray made Flippy once again come back to life. And now Flippy wants to destroy all do-gooders. And in the process of the tank puncturing, the living spray also makes the living spray factory building come to life. And so Flippy and the factory decide to attack Dogman and Petey on his quest to destroy all do-gooders. But then he ends up seeing that there's a completely different do-gooder, Little Petey. He is the goodest do-gooder that has ever been. So Flippy the fish captures Little Petey, and unfortunately, Dogman does his best, but he can't do anything. And Petey tries to save Little Petey, but he can't because he's handcuffed. And so Petey recommends that Dogman and Petey put aside their differences so that they can work together to rescue Petey. At which point Dogman says, why don't we use a mailman to attack Petey? Mailmans are the most deadly thing in the world. Yeah, that's very far from the truth. But then Petey comes up with an idea, why don't we build a giant mech that's modeled after a mailman? So they use that mech to battle against the Living Spray Factory. Unfortunately, when the Living Spray Factory is defeated in battle and dies, the Living Spray goes outside of the factory and then makes all of the buildings around them come to life. So now Flippy has an army of giant buildings, and they end up pummeling the mailman mech. And then the chief of police and Sarah Hadoff, as well as her cameraman, decide to help out with helping Dogman and Petey escape the mailman mech. They help Little Petey escape, at which point Little Petey decides to return to the home base, at which point he tries to get Old Man Petey to help out. He does not. And then he asks ADHD to help out, at which point Little Petey becomes RoboCat. RoboCat ends up attacking Flippy and the army of giant buildings, and then when that happens, he somehow manages to destroy most of the buildings. Unfortunately, ADHD is badly damaged in the battle, and so that's when Petey comes up with an idea that he can take Little Petey's place, because Flippy is trying to destroy RoboCat, but he doesn't know that Little Petey is RoboCat. So he hops into the battle-damaged suit, at which point Flippy decides to destroy RoboCat by throwing him into an active volcano. So, Little Petey and Dogman try to come up with a plan to rescue Petey from Flippy, and that's when Dogman realizes that Petey has kind of been on a path of redemption. He's not exactly a good guy, but he is actually trying to be good for the sake of Little Petey's safety because he loves him. So, they gotta find some way to connect with Flippy to make him go good. And when they do that, they end up creating a comic, and they show it to Flippy, and good news and bad news. The good news being that the comic does work, and Flippy does end up melting his heart, and he does try to go good. Unfortunately, by going good, his evil powers go kaput, and he was using those evil powers to hold Petey above the volcano, and without those powers, Petey is going to fall right back down into the volcano. At which point, Dogman uses the squirrel tank mech, but without any ammo, he has to use the one thing that actually fits into the cannon, his tennis ball, his most prized possession from his life as Greg the dog. And so he puts the tennis ball into the tank, fires, and the tennis ball ends up hitting ADHD and Petey, knocking them outside of the volcano, but in the process, the ball ricochets into the lava. So, bye-bye, tennis ball. But thankfully, Petey and ADHD are saved. And that's when Dogman is supposed to go through with the arrest, but that's right when the mayor shows up and says that with Sarah Hadoff there reporting all of the scenes of Petey on his act of redemption, she decides to pardon Petey, and I think there's two reasons why. First off, it's because she wants to get a good image that she's a fair and just mayor because it's almost re-election time. And reason number two, her brother is the owner of Cat Jail. And every time Petey escapes from Cat Jail, it ends up tarnishing his reputation. So if Petey doesn't go to prison, he can't escape. And so her brother's reputation isn't ruined. So with that in mind, Flippy is actually arrested, but Petey is given a chance at a new life. So he and little Petey decide to go home, and when they get there, they realize that Old Man Petey stole everything. He just emptied out the entire building of all the furniture in a moving van and then up and left. The one thing that he didn't take was the comics that little Petey made out of love. And it's at that moment that a mailman arrives with the undo clone button that Petey ordered when he found out that little Petey wasn't actually a clone, just a miniature version of him. But after taking one look at little Petey, he decided, no, I'm never gonna delete this kid. And he throws it down the sewer. And so little Petey begins to see the world as a depressing place. This whole time, Petey has been saying that little Petey needs to grow up to be evil. And the reason is because, well, the world is depressing, and being a supervillain is depressing, and you want to be depressed because it's fun.
You're destined to be a villain.
Is that fun?
So much fun. Fun! Surrounded by, miserable suffering, loneliness, and zero appreciation. I mean, zero. Do you even know what I'm saying?
No, but it sounds fun. I want to be miserable too.
Good, that's the spirit.
So little Petey is trying to see the bright side of the world, but unfortunately now that he's depressed, all he's seeing is the blackness and misery that Petey taught him. And so Petey realizes he made a mistake, and he says that this world has its flaws, but it can never truly be a bad place as long as you're in it. And that's when little Petey says that Dogman is in the world too. And at this point, Dogman is being pretty miserable. At first, he was happy taking care of little Petey, but the problem is that little Petey actually has a dad. He's not some orphan. So Dogman had to say goodbye to little Petey so he could live with his actual papa. But then Petey and little Petey show up at his doorstep, and then Petey says, I think it's okay if little Petey comes over for a few visits from time to time. So I really enjoyed that ending because it kind of made both Dogman and Petey, who are arch rivals and hate each other, co-dads. They're starting to warm up to each other through their love of little Petey. And so, as Petey drops off little Petey and walks off on his own, he starts to see the world through little Petey's eyes. He sees weeds as beautiful flowers. He sees pollution in a lake as a source of recycled beauty, even going so far as to take an empty bottle out of the lake and use it as a vase for his weed flowers. And then he even goes back to howl at the moon with Dogman and little Petey. And that's when the movie ends on a cliffhanger by introducing a brand new building who actually survived the attack, except that building is a laser show building just trying to start a dance party. And he is actually pretty successful. So not quite the same kind of cliffhanger ending as the Captain Underpants movie, but still. And that's it for my review. Honestly, this movie was really fun. It was very well written with its humor, but it was also pretty creative with the way it handled its story because it was really good, especially when it came to the emotional moments. My problem is that unlike the Captain Underpants movie, which just took basic concepts from the book series and then assembled it together into one story, what the Dogman movie did was straight up take scenes out of the Dogman book series and then reassemble them into a cohesive story. Sure, Captain Underpants wasn't creative with its villain like Professor Poopy Pants, but it was creative with his master plan. It had a completely brand new story that wasn't in the book series. With Dogman, while there are a few new ideas, the problem is that most of the main plot is already told in the book. However, those plots are all each their own individual book. Here, it's all shumbled together to make one cohesive story, and while that does mean we're going from plot A to plot E to plot B to plot C to plot A to plot B to plot Z, yeah, the plot points were all over the place, and we were just hopping from one story to another, then another, and then another. We could get so caught up in Petey trying to convince little Petey to be a bad guy, while little Petey is trying to reacquaint Petey with his father, and then out of nowhere, Flippy the fish shows up, which is kind of weird. So, in summary, this movie was actually really funny and for the most part pretty well written. Problem is that the reason it's well written is because most of those scenes are taken directly from the official books made by Dave Pilkey. There's no original story here. There are a few scenes that are created to make the movie funnier or just change it a bit, or even to make it so that they can make the story cohesive. But again, the problem is there's no original story. Despite that, this movie was very emotional and it had a lot of scenes that would just make me go, "Aww!" In fact, I would say this is probably the single cutest movie that DreamWorks has ever made. So I highly recommend that you go and watch it in theaters, not only for the movie itself, but also so you can support the Bad Guys short film, saying we want theatrical short films to come back, but also so you can support the Dog Man and, by extension, the Captain Underpants franchise. If we could get a sequel to either of these, I know a lot of fans who would be very happy. In fact, there is a lot of source material to pull from in both franchises, and even new spin-offs that could be created. Unfortunately, I'm going to save that for another video because this one is already way too long. So with that in mind, I hope that you guys consider supporting my channel by joining my membership program, or you can just do the free option and subscribe. Be sure to keep an eye out for my Captain Underpants, Dogman, and vice versa sequel predictions. But with that in mind, I hope you're all staying safe out there, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye-bye.
Petey escaped again!
Again? Again!
Yeah, that's why I said again, yet again!